in the fuel system can stick in the open position.
Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this discussion on contract terms and conditions. Me personally, I do see there's obviously an internal aspect to it. There's also a sales side to it that we all have to be aware of and implement. And it's just really good information to know and go through. And with us today is Jeremy Morrow. He's our Global Treasury Manager. For some of you who may or may not know Jeremy, but he will be joining us, and he will be going into the details of the revised contract terms and conditions. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy, who is already on the line. And Jeremy, all you got to do is click share screen.
Okay. Just, give me 1 second here. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yes. Yes, we can. Looks good.
Great. All right, so first of all, thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate this. This is obviously not one of the more entertaining topics that people might have to encounter, but you know, as Derek had mentioned, there's definitely some crossover to the sales area, and I'd like to try to highlight a little bit of that and why this is, you know, hopefully good for you guys to kind of learn a little bit more about and work with, certainly the AE area as well. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about the current process. So the way things work now, we have a deal negotiated with the customer typically. And that includes, obviously, the quote, what we're going to deliver, how we're going to deliver it. There's a lot of information that you guys put together and a lot of work that's done. So once that's kind of completed, then what we're doing is we're reviewing these terms and conditions and saying, you know, where do we have some tweaks or where do we, you know, maybe need to make some changes. And what we're finding is, hey, you know, while we thought we had a deal, we don't necessarily have a deal yet, Mr. Customer. And I'm sure as salespeople, you can probably all kind of identify with what comes next. So, you know, I think that the whole process here should not only benefit us as a corporation, but hopefully you personally on the sales front in dealing with customers, because I know that there are times we go back to people and they're pretty, you know, displeased that we're saying, well, we can't live with this or we can't live with that. And oftentimes these are documents that we have in possession or could have in our possession at the beginning of the sales process. So with that said, here's sort of the enhanced look to it. What I would really like to try to do, and this is going to be somewhat of, I think, a cultural shift in our organization, is to start getting these boilerplate terms and conditions, because that's what they are. You know, these customers have all this information. I'm sure I'm not saying anything that people aren't aware of, but they have this information available for us, and it really wouldn't hurt for us to ask and take a look at that stuff earlier in the sales cycle, especially, you know, if we're talking about a customer that we do repeat business with or maybe doing repeat business with, or we know, hey, this is going to be a big deal, and, you know, they're going to need us to sign something. We can't just get away with saying, you give us a PO and we're not going to sign it. And that's sort of often our business model. So the first thing we want to do now is we want to get these terms and conditions, and we want to get a review process around them. Then we can sit down and negotiate the deal with the customer. And so if we can get that review done prior to the actual pricing, delivery, speccing, all those types of things, or get it done concurrently, then we're going to be in a much better position to kind of close the deal quickly without any kind of hiccups, pushback, you know, threats to leave or walk away from the deal, that type of thing. So if we can do it this way and put the horse, you know, sort of before the cart, then we're going to be able to say to the customer at the end of that process confidently, you know, we've got everything buttoned up, we're ready to go. And, you know, of course, it's going to make it rain for us, gentlemen. So that's sort of the idea behind this. And we need to talk about, you know, who's going to be involved and what are they going to do. So at the front end, people that we have that are customer facing, the application engineers, people that are in the sales process. They're the people who are best positioned to, number one, get these terms and conditions for us, and number two, to kind of take a look through them and identify any sort of deal breakers at the outset, because the longer we have in the sales cycle to kind of identify these really big problems, the easier it will be to resolve them and or hand those off for resolution, ultimately through Mike Schultz and then to myself for assistance on the back end to try to get these things, sort of hammered out. The more time we have, the much better off it is for everybody. The more I'm able to help, the less kind of hiccups we have as we go through. So, that said, we have a couple of risk categories that we want to look at. We want to look at things that are low risk, things that are considered medium contractual risk, and things that are high risk. So starting off, let's look at these low risk items. The first one would be the acceptance of goods or work. So, one of the things that we want to look at under there will generally be a title or a clause or paragraph that talks about accepting work. And in that, we should see that there's not an opportunity for indefinite delay. So oftentimes, we might see that even in a payment section where it'll say, payment to be made upon acceptance of work, and the acceptance of the work occurs upon either a contractor or an owner saying that, yeah, everything's good to go, maybe issuing a certificate or something of that nature. But it doesn't really say when that could happen. And we have to be very careful, because if we're talking about a large capital project, like for example, we do a lot of work with Sakhalin, which is a big refinery in the Sakhalin seaport in Russia. That project could be going on for years. So when does final acceptance occur? We really need to make sure we get a date in there. We are looking at not only the risk level as low on this one, because this isn't one of these things where it could blow up and take down the entire business. But the acceptability is also low, because it's not acceptable for us to do work and not have an idea about when we're going to get paid. There should be some certainty. I know that we ran into this in APAC, for example, where there's a couple of nuclear reactors that are being built by the Chinese government, and whenever we accepted these contracts initially, there was no certain date for payment, and we are still waiting, I think, a year or two later to get those, waiting for those reactors to come online and be available to the public. So that's something to keep in mind. Not huge risk, but not really acceptable from our standpoint. Audit of records, also pretty low risk. One thing to keep in mind on these items, there will typically be a section where it says what documents that we have to retain. You just have to be careful that the section doesn't say that the customer has the right to look at all of our corporation's records. I don't see that often, but I have seen it from time to time. My old job, I did a lot of construction type contracts, larger machinery type contracts, and that from time to time someone would kind of sneak something in like that. Well, it's not relevant to the project. Usually customers are amenable to changing it, and it is a low acceptability item, because we cannot offer the records of the entire organization just because the customer wants to be able to look at them. Once again, for payment, we have payment condition on something in addition to the satisfactory receipts of goods or services. So a big one here might be like pay when paid. I don't know if anyone here has kind of heard that, but that's something we've had sort of another lesson learned on in APAC. We had a customer who was a very good distributor of ours, and we sold them a bunch of stuff, but we did it on a pay when paid contract, and their customers stiffed them. So we're in the process of getting that all worked out, and I believe that we will. But we should never have payment conditioned upon anything other than us fulfilling our responsibilities as a business to provide the heating equipment and whatnot that we've agreed to provide. It should certainly never be conditioned on anything that's outside of our control and in the control of a third party, such as a pay when paid clause, meaning that our customer will pay us when their customer pays them. That's definitely something that we have to look at. Now, there could be some instances where this might be acceptable. So, for example, if we know who the end customer is and we have an excellent relationship with that customer as well as perhaps our distributor in the middle, something in that regard, then it might be possible or reasonable to accept it based on an analysis of the situation and whether or not we think that it's okay. So you never want to say this is never okay, but we want to say that we should avoid that situation if all possible. An entity, that kind of just covers, an entity not party to the contract that has decision-making rights as well. That was something I just talked about, but once again, there are conditions when that might be acceptable. So, anytime something other than us doing our work is the trigger for payment, we want to raise our hand and say, no, this isn't okay. Termination for cause, we want to make sure that, this is something that's very unlikely. That's why it's a low-risk item, low probability of occurring. But, we want to make sure that the counterparty doesn't have the right to seize our equipment. Lots of times these contracts might say, hey, if we kick you off the job for a cause, we're going to keep your equipment for as long as we like. No, it's not really all right. And, there's all kinds of other issues that come up with that as well, insurance issues and that type of thing. But we want to make sure that we're not going to be exposed to unreasonable risks for our equipment and or third-party expenses. So, sometimes it'll say something like, hey, if you guys don't do what you're supposed to do and there's a breach of contract, then we can terminate for cause. And we'll get into a little bit more on why this can be risky in a few minutes. But we can terminate for cause, and when we do this, we're going to go get another contractor, and you're going to have to pay for it. And it doesn't matter how much it costs. Well, that could be catastrophic, and we don't really want that to happen. I'd say it's a low-risk item, even though it could be very costly to us, because really, who's going to throw you off a job when you get there? Practically speaking, we don't expect that to happen, but it could, and you never want to give that opportunity to arise. So depending on how onerous the penalties could be, we would say that we have some tolerance for accepting this. Maybe there will be some tools that will be left on site until perhaps the remainder of our goods provided are incorporated into the work, and then we get them back, something like that. But we should be able to work with the customer on that too. And by the way, all these things here that are on this low risk page, these are things that the customer, in my experience, typically should be working with us on. That's why I'm saying if we get this stuff up front, and we get a look at it up front, we can usually get this stuff hammered out. It's really not a big problem. Once again, under termination for cause, we want an opportunity to fix any kind of issues that we may have had. So, things happen. Maybe there's a disagreement on something. Maybe there's a revision that somehow got missed on the customer side on a handoff to us, or because changes that they're making. I don't really know, but the point is that we should have an opportunity, if they say there's a problem, to fix that problem. I think that's pretty reasonable and pretty fair. The contract states that, and so this is where I mentioned a few minutes ago where termination kind of comes in. The contract states that a breach of any terms, even minor ones, could be considered material, and there's usually a clause in there that in the contract, or many times there's a clause in the contract that says the breach of any of these terms is considered material or gives the right to terminate. And if that's the case, if you think about it, boy, that could be late delivery. That could be, maybe delivering something that's slightly out of spec. And then, of course, that opens the door to all kinds of interpretation. What is spec, what isn't, that type of thing. So we want to make sure that a breach of terms does not give an automatic right to termination for cause, because you can lose a whole lot of money under a circumstance like that. And then the last piece under this, I think it's the last one, last piece under termination for convenience, we want to make sure that we're paid appropriately if there's a termination for convenience. So the customer all of a sudden decides, like, okay, we need to delay this project for 6 months, or we're just going to stop working here and we don't want to keep going because of X, Y, or Z, yet, you know, we've already sunk a whole bunch of money or time into this, and we've maybe mobilized to a site, or, you know, who knows what it might be. We want to make sure that our time and efforts, including any kind of wrap-up expenses, are going to be considered fairly under that contract. So before we move on to the moderate risk items, and by the way, guys, that is the largest section of items to cover. But before we move on, does anyone have any questions at this point?
Jeremy, it's a little hard to hear you. Are you using a headset or?
No, I'm not using a headset.
Coming in and out.
Okay, is that better? I'm sticking my head under my monitor. Is that better?
That's better, yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
We're hearing most of it, but it's kind of fuzzing every once in a while.
Okay. So I'll tell you what.
Yeah.
Let me head back here. Does anyone have any questions on any of these items specifically, things that they're maybe interested in hearing a little bit more about, don't understand why it may be an issue, disagree with, anything like that? Okay. Does anybody want me to go back over something that might have been fuzzy that I didn't come through clearly on? Because this is good stuff. I
think we heard it all. It was just, yeah, okay. I think, I mean, definitely the point to everyone on the call, too, is, I mean, I like your point of asking ahead of time. I don't think enough of us are conditioned, like you said, kind of a change in your kind of the way you operate, conditioned to ask for this stuff up front. If you're got a project or you got something you're working on, even before we start working on the quote, it makes sense as you know, field sales or whoever, hey, you know, we're planning on getting this order, so let's get this stuff negotiated now. And it also kind of opens up your, first of all, you gauge the engagement of the customer, you know, how, you know, of their interest in working with you, and then you also can, you know, kind of get ahead of the game and show you have vested interest. So I just, sorry.
No, I really appreciate that comment, actually. I think that it's true and very helpful. And the nice thing is that, you know, all these items are going to kind of be put into a matrix. Well, they already are, and that'll be distributed to everybody on the call. You know, it's easy stuff to look for. You know, you just look for it, you kind of tick it off and raise your hand and say, this is what I saw. And if we start getting down the path a little bit with these guys a little more, and it starts to look a little more serious, or this is a hot, you know, a rush job, and hey, they want to order, then we know ahead of time what we have to ask them about. So we don't have to sink a lot of work into looking at these things or negotiating them, just knowing that they're there, so that whenever we sense that it's the right time to speak to them about these things, when we're talking to them about everything else, we can get this on the table in front of them and get it negotiated, instead of having to get a deal done with them and then backtrack and you know, go back to the well. So thank you. I appreciate that comment. I think it's very helpful to everybody. And I think that, you know, all the people here that have all this experience with customers probably understand the frustration that a customer may express when they're surprised with something like this after they think that they've got something hammered out. So we want to prevent that and make everyone's lives easier, including yours. So the moderate risk items, there's only a few of these. Change orders. One thing I see a lot of on change orders, and this is regardless of whether this is a construction type contract or if it's machinery or whatever it is, sometimes you'll see that a change order, we can be forced or compelled by the customer to proceed with preparing this change order and executing it, even if we've not been able to agree on a price. And that seems a little bit ridiculous when you think about it, because what ends up happening is, most of the time, the language is, hey, if we can get relief, let's say it's a contractor, if we can get equitable relief from the owner, then we'll go ahead and pass that along to you, which, you know, essentially says, if we get paid for extra, we'll give you some extra, and we'll negotiate it. If we don't get paid, you'll still go ahead and do the work. And we can't accept anything like that. That's you know, I'd say it's more of a moderate risk item because people are pretty good about change orders in general. I mean, no one wants to be a bad actor and go out and work their vendors over like that, because you'll get a reputation pretty soon and no one will want to be a supplier. But, you still have to be careful with that language because, sometimes you do run into someone that's maybe a little bit overzealous as a project manager and, hey, there wasn't a change order and, we're not going to agree on this price. We think it's ridiculous, and they'll try to compel you to move forward. So we need to be careful about that. We want to make sure there's also a force majeure clause. So, basically this is saying anything that is outside of our control. Building gets hit by lightning, there's an earthquake, there's riots, whatever it might be, we're granted some relief in terms of time to deliver, kind of stops the clock from running. And it's especially important whenever there's LDs or something like that involved. But we want to make sure that there's a force majeure clause because sometimes strange things happen and we don't want to be held accountable for something that we couldn't have reasonably foreseen as an impediment to our progress. So that's something to make sure that they include one of those. And then warranties. This is the last sort of medium risk item. Just like acceptance of work, we want to make sure that there is a hard timeline for warranties. One of the things I'm seeing a lot of recently is, hey, you do warranty work for us, great, but that new warranty work that you did restarts either for that piece or the entire project, whatever it is, restarts the clock ticking, and it's another 12 months. And that could go on indefinitely. Or, hey, the warranty starts whenever the site is completed and the project is done. Well, if this is a 5-year capital expenditure and it's a big, liquid natural gas plant or something like that, and it's taking multiple years to finish, when does that warranty period start? So we need to make sure that there's language to prevent us from getting stuck with a warranty that's essentially evergreen. We recently had a problem with something like that where we got tagged for about $50,000 because we had an extended warranty out there from a contract, and we were forced to honor it, and we were obligated. So that can happen. It does happen. So here are the high-risk items, and these are the things we never, ever want to get ourselves into, or if we do, it's because it's a business decision made at an appropriate executive level of management. The first thing is indemnifications. So we never, ever, ever want to waive any provision of any workers' comp law or any other disability or legal protection law on the books, because I don't know who's familiar with workers' comp or how it works, but essentially what it does is it says, for the following injuries or the following circumstances that may have impacted an employee, there is a cap on the amount of damages, and that caps our liability. Now, let's say that, wherever we have people working, maybe it's at a third party or something like that, let's say something goes wrong. And that third party was responsible. They did something bad. Like they did something that they should have known better than. I'll give you an example. The last place I was, we had a gentleman who was doing some work, and somebody, for whatever reason, had turned a hose on, and there were some concrete steps that were very slippery. This poor gentleman went down the steps and broke his neck. So these sort of things happen. It's not hypothetical. It was horrible what happened to this guy. And, if you have something in place like this, where we are waiving protections for workers' comp laws, essentially what happens is we take on the legal liability in excess of any workers' compensation claim that might be due to negligence, gross negligence, or something like that. So if a third party is indemnified and they take an action that causes something horrific to happen to somebody, and it unfortunately does happen, we then end up getting all the liability associated with that, even if it's not our fault. So that's not okay. We can't do that, and if we do agree to do that, then we've got to make sure that that's something that's been, sort of vetted by an appropriate level of executive management, and agreed to, and is kind of mitigated, the risks are mitigated with a proper safety plan and EH&S coordination, that type of thing. That's something we recently encountered on the Salon project with coal, and that risk was indeed mitigated by safety planning on our part. So it was a calculated business risk that we decided to take. But that's at a level that's well above me, and that's something that we can't agree to. So if you see that, that's a big red flag, and we need to raise our hands immediately and try to get that worked out. Oftentimes I've found customers are willing to take that out. So it just depends. Some are sticklers, some aren't. Liquidated damages. We want to make sure that when we calculate our project margins, that any potential liquidated damages, we would assume it at 100%. And if those liquidated damages at 100% end up bringing the project margin below what our acceptable thresholds are, then we need to raise our hand and say, hey, there's a problem here. So, a liquidated damage might be 3% or 5% of overall contract value or something like that. But, if that 3 or 5% takes us, because we've already priced competitively, if that takes us below what we would have accepted otherwise, then we need to raise our hands and kind of stop that process, because we're not priced to accept that level of liquidated damage at that time. Time is of the essence. So there's time is of the essence clauses in most contracts, and they are usually not enforceable except in the type of business that we are in. So what that means is even 1 day delay on anything can be considered a material breach of contract, for which, one, liquidated damages become accessible, but number two, there could be a termination for cause. So we want to be careful about accepting that language and try to get that out if at all possible. Now, a time is of the essence clause without liquidated damages is absolutely unacceptable. Time is of the essence with liquidated damages as the sole remedy, okay. As long as those LDs don't bring us below a margin where we're not going to be in an acceptable gross margin for the project. This one here, I don't have an acceptability rating for it, but this is just something for us to think about. Every single document, and it happens all the time, I think, because, you get these contracts and, man, there are 30, 40, 50 pages already, and then there's the exhibits. And the exhibits are another 20, 30, 40, 50 pages, whatever they might be. It's hard to go through all those things. But we have to remember that every single exhibit carries the same legal weight as the body of the contract document. Case in point, prime example, I know this is something that Matt Highland and I ran into with one of the customers over in projects. The project, or the customer, had a lien waiver. It was a final lien waiver that said, all right, we're paying you the final amount that we owe you, and you're going to go ahead and indemnify us and release us from any liens that may occur because you didn't pay your people or you didn't pay suppliers or something like that. Okay, fair enough. Like, we should absolutely be willing to guarantee a customer that we're satisfying our obligations so that a lien is not placed on their property after they've paid for it. That's totally reasonable. But what happens sometimes is they'll stick sort of other things or riders in these lien waivers, and that lien waiver would have been in an exhibit to the initial contract document, and if we didn't take exception to it at the time, we could end up like really shooting ourselves in the foot. So this particular one I'm thinking about, the lien waiver said, oh, and by the way, you're indemnifying us against any and all claims that may arise anytime between now and whatever point in the future from anything whatsoever that is ever related to the work, from a third party, from an internal party, whatever it might be. So what that meant was someone could literally take one of our heaters and, take one of the heating elements and bend it into a pot of kerosene and blow up an entire fertilizer plant, and we would be legally responsible for indemnifying that customer against any kind of damages that would have been associated with that. As ridiculous as that sounds, that is the type of thing that a lot of these contracts have hidden in them. And you have to stop and think about that, because really it has to be fair and it has to be reasonable. And we need to make sure that we at least glance through these exhibits, understand what comprises them, and understand what the potential risks are. This is another big one. Indemnifying somebody for activities wholly caused by them. So you'll see a lot of times where it says, contractor or supplier agrees to indemnify in whole or in part for any sort of thing that goes wrong. Well, when they say in whole, what they're talking about is their culpability, their contribution or negligence or degree of responsibility for any sort of an adverse event. This clause is so onerous that in many, if not more than half or most states, it's not even legally enforceable. But it is in several other ones. And unless, we don't, we don't want to gamble at this, because what this means is that if we indemnify them for something that they do exclusively, then we're on the hook for all of it. And, oh, by the way, our insurance won't pay, because insurance no longer, for the last several years, you cannot buy commercial general liability insurance that covers third-party acts. We have to be at least 1% negligent or contributory negligence or whatever you want to call it in order to have insurance coverage. Because if we don't have insurance coverage, then all those expenses will come out of our pocket, and you can see that something like that could get very expensive very quickly, and can certainly really damage this business as a whole from one act or one accident. Especially if we're not at fault, why should we be accepting that liability? That we never ever want to accept that. That's why that just has an N next to it. Also, indemnifying a party for any damages claimed by a third party, including consequential damages. So let's think about maybe like an electric utility, right? Let's say that we're doing some work for an electricity plant and a generating station, and I don't know, something happens and we're not able to do what we have to do, and the thing shuts down for like a day or who knows, and there's, all the ice cream shops, and this is in Arizona or Texas or who knows, and all the ice cream shops in the area, their electricity go out, and all the ice cream melts, or supermarkets, or whatever it might be. Now you have these third parties that will be coming back on the utility and saying, what happened to the power? Was this like some sort of act of God? Was this a storm, or was this something you could have prevented? And then the finger ends up getting pointed at us, and we have these what they call consequential damages coming in. That could be massive amounts of money. Kind of like trying to think of like the analogy, like in a personal lawsuit, like you would have your direct damages, but then you have I can't think of the term, but like these damages like that are kind of like in your face, a jury awards $100 million. You guys have heard that type of thing. Well, this happens with corporations too. They get sued from outside parties, and there's massive claims. And if we don't have some kind of a protection in the indemnification or from these types of things, and we're not walled off or insulated behind the walls of the customer, we cannot accept that. We cannot have somebody saying, no matter what happens, any third party that wants any kind of money, we're pointing right back to you. Because oftentimes these clauses don't even say it's our fault, but would say arising from the work. So that could mean anything. It could mean this thing has been installed and functioning appropriately for 5 or 10 years. Something happened, and it happened because of somebody else, and boom. Here's a great example. So we had, not terribly long ago, there was a fire in a place that had some of our heaters in it, okay? And apparently the heating element, if I'm not mistaken, was installed incorrectly. Number one,
it was not on a GFI like it should have been, and we were not the installers. There was an electrician that did it, and they didn't follow the instructions. And number two, it was placed, so it started to, I think it started to arc or spark a little bit. It was placed over, literally, over combustible fluids, and it caused a fire. Well, if we had something in the contract that said that we're responsible for anything arising from the work, regardless of the fault, then that would have been horrible. I mean, we would have been on the hook for a lot of money, and our insurance would not have covered that either. I think this might be the last one, I'm not sure, but limitations of liability. We want to make sure two things. Number one, we should never be liable for an amount that exceeds a contract or purchase order value. Now, okay, maybe twice the amount depending on the size of the purchase order. It's a $50,000 purchase order, and there's a $100,000 limit or something like that, or a $50,000 contract, you know, and $100,000 limit on liability. Okay. But, you know, ideally, we need to have some sort of a limit in there that's rational, that we can't go into this job, disgorge all the money that we made on it, having already paid for the product, and then be on the hook for more on top of that. That's ridiculous. Oftentimes, however, a contract will call for that. And the other thing we need to remember about this is oftentimes you'll see and you'll think you're okay. So this is a big thing to watch out for. You'll think you're okay because you'll see some sort of a limitation of liability inside the indemnification clause. As long as the limitation of liability exists inside of an indemnification clause, it's not enforceable. It's not valid because it solely relates to the indemnification itself, which is legally a duty to defend against. So you need to have a separate clause all on its own outside of the indemnification that's a limitation of liability. That's a must-have, and customers typically will agree to some sort of a rational value there, because you know you have to have something in place that makes the job worth doing and not just this bottomless pit of risk. And I think that might there's one more here. Okay, so we talked about this a little bit more, the pay when paid clauses. We can never accept that. All right, so I think that that's sort of the end of my diatribe here on these contractual risk items. We're going to have everything that I just went over, just to give you guys some ideas. First of all, it's going to be in a matrix. So you're going to have all this stuff alphabetized that shows you the risk level and the acceptability and what these explanations are, just for your ready reference. So as you're going through a contract and glancing at it, you can glance at this too and make a quick comparison. There are some additional terms and conditions considerations. They're more minor. That will follow on a second page, but they're very readily explainable. They're easy to understand. There is a written document that I'll provide as well, so that if you're going through one of these things and you don't quite understand it, or you need more information, or you want to see if it makes, you know, does this really fit this or not, I have a narrative that takes each of these bullet points and expands on them and explains them more, when you see them, what they are, why it's bad, that type of thing. So you'll have that document too to back up the matrix that you have, which is essentially what I presented was that matrix. And then the last thing to keep in mind is, and this is something that I still have to kind of get off my rear end and get fixed up here, is a lot of these things are already kind of covered in the risk review matrix. So especially on the AE side, I think, or maybe some on the sales side, we're familiar with that tool. But this is going to tie in directly. So it's not going to really increase the amount of work. It'll be sort of on a separate tab and separated, but it'll allow us to kind of go through a checklist and make sure we've checked off each of these points and each of them are okay. That'll feed into the matrix so that it populates that correctly, which will do a couple of things. It makes the review a lot more complete. It documents the review and kind of keeps it together with the risk review itself, and hopefully doesn't add any additional work or you know, kind of constraints. So you know, we're going to have to talk a little bit more in the future about how we get people involved and get people, you know, kind of helping out and looking at these things. But really, up front, we want to be grabbing these terms and conditions and bringing them in and glancing through them and seeing, do we see anything that's a deal breaker, and then raising our hand to the appropriate people. Probably myself, Mike Schultz would be another individual. Certainly the AE team, you know, should be glancing at these things too. We want to have more eyes, not less, and we want it to be kind of a quick, easy review, not onerous or difficult. And I think that's going to make things better overall and make some people's lives a whole lot easier to have more people taking a quick minute or two to look at stuff earlier in the process. So, you know, really everyone needs to be doing that and helping out. And, you know, I think that going forward, the appropriate instructions will probably come, you know, from leaders on the sales team and application engineering as to who does what and how. But really, we do all need to start taking this seriously. This is, you know, certainly this is something that Spirax Sarco takes very seriously. It was an audit finding. We just had an internal audit here, and the results, one of the things that they were adamant about was we need to get our arms around contract risk. So this comes from, you know, on high. This is not something that we're just kind of doing to waste time or you know, make work for people. We have an obligation as a business to do this. And to start, you know, I mean, honestly, guys, you really got to think about it like this. A team is only as strong as its weakest link. Well, what happens if that weakest link happens to be a contract that slipped through that ends up with some sort of a catastrophic loss, and people start losing their jobs because it really hits us, and that happens. I mean, it's not a joke. It occurs, and we need to, you know, just be watching each other's backs here. That's what this is about. You know, making sure we all have a job to come to tomorrow. So those are my thoughts, and you know, I'd love to take any kind of questions or feedback or you know, anything that you guys want to talk about. I would certainly welcome that. And here's my angry orange-looking guy here. Derek seemed to like
know
him.
what that was.
I think it's a grapefruit. I'm not sure.
Well, I mean, there's certainly a lot more to terms and conditions. I mean, me personally, I think it's, you know, a negotiating tool. I think it's important for, you know, us in front of the customers to understand why, you know, risk mitigation, like you mentioned, it's a bottomless, you know, pit of risk. Also, Jeremy, I guess I would have a question, and this has come up over years past. We're real adverse to signing POs, which I totally understand why. I mean, is that something we're going to be more required or pushing to do now, or just no signing POs?
No, we want this to be as low maintenance and low work as possible. We should not start signing POs just because of this. We should sign less POs. You know, because the way that I look at it is that these things. So here's the quick background on that. Here's why that works. Okay, so customer sends us a purchase order. We send back a purchase order acknowledgement. We never sign anything. We send them an invoice. They send us a check. In that scenario, when you look at it, they have sent us something that says, here's our terms and conditions, and you agree to abide by them. When we send that PO acknowledgement back, that's got our terms and conditions in it, along with a statement that these govern. And if that's the last word prior to invoicing, which they accept, and then send us money for, that's an exchange of consideration. It consummates that contract under our terms and conditions exclusively and is enforceable. And so we don't want to rock that boat. That's a good process. So less is more, you know. This is for, you know, higher dollar value items or places where we know up front someone's going to make us sign something. We don't want to get caught at the last minute having accepted an order and then, you know, we're kind of, our backs are against the wall because, hey, we want this business, and the customer knows that they have us, and, you know, that's a situation we want to avoid.
Excellent.
So everyone just loved it. No questions, huh?
No, this is Matt Deltano. I had a question. Jeremy, this is something you and I recently emailed each other back and forth about that I didn't quite see on there, and that's the bank guarantee and letter of credit that sometimes gets put in the POs.
Uh-huh. Those are okay.
That ends up being an invoice. So I didn't see that on the list, but I don't know if that was something that worth bringing up.
So these are things that we're worried about. A letter of credit or a bank guarantee is not something that we're worried about. It's something we would typically provide in normal course of business, and we're happy to do so if needed for a customer. So there's really not a lot in the way of risk around one of those, except that we do, and thank you for mentioning it actually, and maybe this is something I should add. Let me make a note here. All right, so we do want to make sure that those letters of credit are rational themselves. So if the customer is asking for specific verbiage, and maybe that verbiage is not something that's acceptable to our bank or would open us up to too much risk, or the customer wants a warranty one and it goes, I don't know, 5 years beyond the end of the warranty date or something like that, then there will be an issue. So, Matt, thank you very much for your comment. I think that is probably something I upon retrospect, would want to add to this. So that's very good feedback, and I'll certainly add that in. But yeah, we want to make sure that any kind of letters of credit, that along with, and we should be getting that up front with the contract terms conditions, and we should be getting all the exhibits, and we should be getting that as an exhibit, and that should be routed to me for review. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions out there for Jeremy?
Yeah, I have a question. This is Brian Kutch. So I understand that we have this chart, the table, and we have kind of contractual areas to look at, and you explain the risk and the explanation of the risk. But can we receive examples of, like, acceptable and unacceptable language? I just know personally I could read an indemnification section of a contract 5-10 times and walk away with nothing more than I started out on the first time. So I would need some direction as far as what is considered acceptable language and unacceptable language.
Yeah, I can probably try to do that. The problem with it is that there's so many different flavors of it, and it comes in so many different ways. Just heading back to the indemnification, for your knowledge here, we want to have a couple of buzzwords perhaps that we're looking out for. Workers' comp, that's one thing we want to look for. We want to look out for third parties. Because it'll literally say third party, outside party, something like that. That's a red flag. We want to look also for words like consequential damages, which we see over here, indirect damages, lost profits. So these buzzwords are what we're looking for. And then obviously sole negligence, negligence in whole, negligence in part. Maybe one of the other things I can add to this would be a list of sort of words or phrases that if you see something that is similar to that, would that help? Because that might be easier to provide for you.
Yeah, I would agree that if we had at least some guidelines or something to look out for when we're reviewing these so that we can kind of flag it and say that has that term in there, maybe that is an issue. I mean, I probably could read it and still not understand if it's an issue or not, but if I could at least flag it as something that has that type of language or that specific phrasing in it, then I can flag it for further review. But, I mean, like I said, I could just look at those sections of a contract and my eyes will just glaze over.
You and me both, man. I'll tell you. I get it. All right, yeah, so how about a list of red flag words? And what sections of the contract they would apply to. So you get to the indemnification, look out for these words or phrases. You get to the insurance, look out for these words or phrases. How's that?
Yeah, I think that would help a lot.
All right, we can do that. Anybody else? All right. Well,
hey,
yeah.
while we're getting to the end of the hour here, I'm gonna switch it back over to mine here real quick. You had a summary slide.
One more slide
right
for
here.
you if I can pop that up. There you go.
Should be up for everyone. Yep.
Thank you. All right. So just as a reminder, and this is sort of a segue, we're gonna do on the 2nd, I believe, Derek. That's right. 2nd at is it 1:30?
Next Friday. Yep. Next
Okay.
Friday. That would be 1:30 Mountain, so 3:30 Eastern. I guess 12:30 Pacific.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about the actual credit process for new customers, and boy, that should go hand in hand with the terms and conditions review. We want that information earlier in the process, not later. We don't want to necessarily have to wait for an order to come in. Obviously, smaller stuff, repeat customers, that type of thing, we don't need to worry about that, but newer customers, big increases in credit lines, that type of thing. We're happy to assist you by providing the credit information up front, so you don't have to go back to your customer with egg on your face and say, sorry, you were denied, we have to have progress payments now, and then there's a tussle. We want to save you hassle. We want to save you having to have that conversation. So that's sort of the same thing with this process. We want to get the horse before the cart. A couple things we're going to talk about just as a primer. Remember, guys, any orders over $25,000, unless there's been prior credit approval, we have to have progress payments. Now, we're going to have to talk a little bit about the project business with those gentlemen to try to figure out what's their normal, since that's sort of a newer thing for us, and it kind of falls outside these bounds a little bit. But for everybody else, we have to have progress payments unless we have prior approval from the credit department. So for existing customers that we're okay with, okay. But we've been running into some times lately where there have been problems, and we'll highlight some of those and the real dangers of them in the next call. The last thing is standard terms are net 30. Anything beyond net 30 also has to get credits approval. And once again, that there may be some variance for the project business on that, and we're going to have to get that all worked out with those guys. But for everybody else, it has to be net 30, and there has to be progress payments unless credit has said okay, and we know it's an existing customer that we do that with, or it's a new customer that you've gotten approval on. So sorry to hammer that home, but that's something we've been having some indigestion with lately, and have had some times where we had to actually go back to the customer after the customer thought they had to deal with us and tell them, no, you have to make progress payments, and it wasn't always a palatable conversation to have. So it's for everybody's benefit, and I think that's the last of it. I'll get off my soapbox for the rest of the day, and I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you so much for listening. Derek, I don't know if you have any wrap-up comments or things that you want to talk about for the next session.
It's a lot of information. I like how you go through it point by point because, like I said, these are negotiation tools. These are more points to touch with the customer, too, to just better, I think it's just a working relationship, really. As you mentioned before, we'll review these two topics next week. There'll be an invite that'll go out this Monday, actually. It'll come out from marketing. It'll come out from Marissa. Jeremy, I appreciate you doing this for us. For anyone else on the call, as these things go, we have our engineering and end user MBT, Monday, the second presentation. You can still go back and take the heat trace product training from last month. That's still readily available. Got a lot of these as we move forward, just different points of Chromalox to learn and go through and understand working with Chromalox from Jeremy's discussion today. So we had the pick and ship program coming out earlier. Got a lot of those programs coming up, so make sure you're looking for those and signing up from there. And with that, if anyone has anything else for Jeremy while we have him, I'd say now's the time to ask.